Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that several broad tariffs imposed under emergency powers were unlawful. As a result, the U.S. government has begun processing tariff refund claims from American importers. The numbers are enormous. Roughly $166 billion in tariffs are potentially affected. More than $85 billion in claims have already been processed, and over $20 billion has already been refunded. Not to foreign governments, not to overseas exporters, but to American companies that originally paid those tariffs when importing goods into the United States. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If American companies are getting the money back, who was actually paying the tariffs all along? And after years of economic confrontation, supply chain disruption, and political battles, what did the tariff war ultimately achieve? Tonight, 5 retired spies examine one of the most controversial economic battles of the modern era. Let's begin. Back with us tonight, Texas Buck McCoy, Colonel Dmitry "The Bear" Volkov, Madame Li Wei, Sir Reginald Hawthorne, Lucas, the Vault Brunner. 5 retired spies. 5 very different worldviews. Some believe the tariffs successfully reshaped global supply chains and strengthened American bargaining power. Others argue the costs outweighed the benefits and that businesses, consumers, and investors ultimately paid the bill. Before we debate the results, let's establish the facts. What exactly happened? And why is America refunding so much money? Lucas, start us off.
The first thing to understand is that the refunds are not going to foreign governments. They are not going to China. They are not going to Mexico. They are not going to overseas exporters. The refunds are going to American companies that previously paid tariffs when importing goods into the United States. This is primarily a domestic legal and financial issue.
That's an important distinction. When tariffs were collected, American importers paid them at the border, not foreign governments, not foreign manufacturers. American businesses wrote the checks. The argument was that tariffs would create economic pressure on foreign producers over time through reduced demand and supply chain adjustments.
Many people misunderstand how tariffs function. The tariff is collected by the importing country. In this case, American importers paid the tariff when goods entered the United States. The current refunds simply return money that those companies previously paid.
The legal trigger is equally important. These refunds are not the result of a new trade agreement. They are not the result of negotiations with China. They stem from court rulings challenging the legal authority under which certain tariffs were imposed.
Which means this is less a diplomatic drama and more a collision between trade policy and constitutional procedure. Far less exciting than a spy novel, but significantly more expensive.
So let's be clear. America is not sending checks to Beijing.
No. The money is returning to American businesses.
And the size of those refunds shows just how much money moved through the tariff system.
One might say the lawyers have become unexpectedly influential participants in international trade.
The key question now is not where the money is going. The key question is what the tariffs actually accomplished before these refunds began.
And that's where the real debate begins. American companies paid the tariffs at the border. But did those costs ultimately stay with importers? Or were they passed on to consumers, investors, foreign exporters, and the broader economy? The answer is far more complicated than many people assume. Buck, start us off.
The answer depends on what time frame you're looking at. In the short term, American importers paid the tariffs. That's simply how the system works. But supporters never argued tariffs were about collecting money. The goal was to change behavior, to encourage companies to diversify supply chains, to reduce dependence on strategic competitors, to force businesses to think differently about risk. And in many cases, that's exactly what happened.
That interpretation overlooks significant costs. Many companies faced higher import expenses. Some passed those costs to consumers. Others accepted lower profit margins. In economic terms, tariffs rarely produce free benefits. Someone always pays. The debate is simply about who pays the largest share.
Economically, both arguments contain truth. The direct tariff payment was made by American importers. However, the broader effect spreads throughout the system. Consumers may face higher prices. Companies may reduce investment. Foreign exporters may lose a market share. The burden is distributed rather than concentrated.
Economic warfare rarely produced clean outcomes: sanctions, tariffs, restrictions. Politicians often present them as precision weapons. Reality is usually messier. Costs appear in unexpected places and affect unexpected people.
Which is why trade wars possess a unique quality. Each side announces victory while simultaneously explaining why everything has become more expensive.
But let's not ignore the strategic result. Many companies began moving production to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and elsewhere.
Moving production is not the same as reshoring production. Many supply chains simply relocated rather than returning.
Which means the trade war changed geography more than it changed globalization.
A remarkably expensive game of industrial musical chairs.
And that may be the most important point. The tariff debate is no longer about who paid. It's about whether the costs produced meaningful strategic benefits.
And that's the heart of tonight's discussion. The tariff war cost billions. It disrupted supply chains. It changed trade patterns around the world. But was it worth it? Supporters argue it reduced strategic dependence and reshaped corporate thinking. Critics argue it raised costs without solving the underlying problem. Several years later, the dust has settled. So what did the tariff war actually achieve? Li Wei, start us off.
That depends on how success is defined. If the goal was to significantly reduce trade between the United States and China, the results were mixed. Trade patterns changed. But global supply chains adapted. Many companies shifted production to third countries. The world became more diversified, but not necessarily less interconnected.
I think that's too narrow. The goal wasn't simply reducing imports. The goal was reducing strategic dependence. Take semiconductors. Take rare earth processing. Take pharmaceutical ingredients. Take battery supply chains. 10 years ago, many governments barely discussed these issues. Today, they're treated as strategic assets. That's not an accident. The tariff war helped push those vulnerabilities into the spotlight. 10 years ago, many executives assumed efficiency was the only thing that mattered. Today, they think about resilience, redundancy, political risk, national security. That's a major change.
Both observations can be true. The tariffs did not reverse globalization, but they did change how governments and corporations think about globalization. That may ultimately be their most lasting effect.
The trade war also changed the language of politics. Before tariffs, discussions focused heavily on efficiency. After tariffs, governments increasingly discussed security, resilience, and supply chain risk. The vocabulary itself changed.
If we follow the data, the answer is nuanced. The tariffs did not produce a dramatic return of manufacturing across the board. However, they contributed to broader diversification trends. Companies now spread production across multiple countries rather than concentrating everything in a single location.
And that's exactly why many supporters consider the policy successful. Strategic concentration was reduced.
Yet diversification is not the same as domestic production. Many factories moved from China to other countries rather than returning to the United States.
Which means the world adjusted rather than reversed course.
Globalization did not retire. It simply changed its address.
And that may be the fairest conclusion. The tariff war did not stop globalization. It reshaped it.
So perhaps the most important result wasn't the tariffs themselves. Perhaps it was the way businesses, investors, and governments began rethinking risk. But if that's true, who actually benefited from those changes? And who lost the most? Let's examine the winners and losers. Dimitri, start us off.
The biggest winners may not have been the countries directly involved. Whenever major powers confront one another economically, third parties often benefit. Vietnam, Mexico, India, several Southeast Asian economies. They attracted investment that might otherwise have gone elsewhere. History often rewards those standing beside the battlefield rather than those fighting on it.
I would agree. Many multinational companies accelerated diversification. Instead of relying heavily on one country, they expanded operations across multiple regions. This reduced concentration risk and created opportunities for emerging manufacturing economies.
But let's not forget the strategic objective. The purpose was never to make Vietnam rich. The purpose was to reduce overdependence on critical supply chains. If companies are now spreading production across multiple countries, that represents a strategic gain from Washington's perspective.
Although one suspects the average voter rarely dreams of waking up and saying, "Excellent news, darling," our supply chain concentration risk has improved significantly.
The largest costs were likely absorbed by a combination of importers, consumers, and businesses operating within disrupted supply chains. The exact distribution varies by industry, but economic friction was unquestionably introduced into the system.
Some costs were unavoidable. National security and economic resilience are rarely free.
The challenge is measuring whether the benefits justify those costs.
And that answer often depends on whether one evaluates economics or strategy.
Indeed, economists ask whether wealth increased. Strategists ask whether vulnerability decreased. The two questions are related, but they are not identical.
And that is why the tariff debate remains unresolved. Both sides can point to evidence supporting their position. The outcome depends largely on which objective receives greater weight.
So perhaps the tariff war produced neither total victory nor total failure. It changed trade patterns, it changed investment flows, and it changed how governments think about economic security. But now the refunds are forcing policymakers to confront a new question. What lessons should they take from all of this? Are we witnessing the end of the tariff era or merely the beginning of a new chapter? Buck?
I don't think tariffs are going away. In fact, I think economic competition is becoming more important. The lesson many policymakers took from the last decade is that supply chains matter. Critical industries matter. Dependence matters. Future policies may look different, but the strategic concerns remain.
I agree that economic competition will continue. However, businesses also value stability. Companies cannot constantly redesign supply chains every few years. Governments may seek more targeted measures rather than broad tariffs.
Maybe. But when politicians feel threatened, broad measures tend to return surprisingly quickly.
And businesses tend to receive the bill surprisingly quickly.
The circle of modern economic life.
The broader trend is clear. Economic security is now viewed as national security. That mindset exists in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and many other capitals. I do not expect that to change.
Which means the age of purely economic globalization may be ending. Politics, security, and trade are becoming increasingly intertwined, rather inconvenient for those who hoped economics would solve everything.
The most likely outcome is neither complete decoupling nor complete integration. Businesses will continue diversifying. Governments will continue managing strategic risks. The world economy will remain connected, but perhaps less concentrated than before.
So perhaps the real legacy of the tariff war isn't the money collected, or even the money refunded. It's the fact that governments, corporations, and investors now think about supply chains very differently than they did a decade ago. Final verdicts.
The tariff war proved that supply chain efficiency and national security are not always the same thing.
The biggest achievement wasn't collecting tariffs. It was forcing governments and businesses to take strategic dependence seriously.
The lesson is that economic competition creates costs for everyone, which is why stability remains valuable.
Economic warfare rarely produces clear winners, but it always changes behavior.
After years of arguments, lawsuits, tariffs, and refunds, we have learned a timeless truth. Global trade is considerably more complicated than political slogans.
5 retired spies, 5 different perspectives, one common conclusion. The tariff war changed far more than trade flows. It changed how governments think about security, how businesses build supply chains, and how investors assess risk. The billions now being refunded may close one chapter, but the debate over economic security, strategic dependence, and global trade is far from over. Which spy do you agree with? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay sharp.